Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. We have 45 minutes to discuss a very important topic: how to salvage cooperation in a world where the common ground between nations as well as within nations is shrinking. To address the topic, we have an outstanding panel. Salome Zurabishvili is the president of Georgia. Joseph Borrell is the High Representative for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy of the European Union and the Vice President of the Commission. They both make policy and they contribute to shaping our world. Mark Leonard is the co-founder and director of the European Council on Foreign Relations, and he helps us understand that world. And myself, Jean-Marie Guénaud, well, I'm in between, having been a practitioner at the United Nations when I was the Undersecretary for Peacekeeping. But also, like Mark, I'm trying now to understand and analyze from a distance. And we both published 2 books. And on many issues, I don't know if I was pleased, but because our conclusions are not always happy, but I saw we are converging. This panel is dedicated to the memory of an extraordinary man who passed away this spring, Wart Gregorian. He was the president of the Carnegie Corporation, of which I have the honor of being a board member. And I would like to say, if I may, a few words about him. Warten was a true Renaissance man. He was an accomplished historian. He wrote the best book on modern Afghanistan. And he had a magic touch for energizing all the institutions he led: the New York Public Library, Brown University, and for close to a quarter of a century, the Carnegie Corporation. He also had a special talent for identifying innovative projects and supporting them from the outset. That is how the Carnegie Corporation was among the very first institutions to support the Paris Peace Forum, which was launched, as you know, on the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. In doing so, the Carnegie Corporation was acting in the very same spirit as its founder, Andrew Carnegie, who hated war and made strenuous efforts to prevent the First World War. Before we start, let me remind you of a couple of housekeeping points. One is for our distinguished speakers. They are strongly encouraged to be concise so as to allow for follow-up questions and interaction with the audience. 45 minutes is not a long time. And one for the members of the audience, to invite them to submit their questions through the chat function and to specify to whom the question is directed. Let me now turn to the President of Georgia. Your country has experienced firsthand what the assertion of raw power can mean, and it has a strong interest in preserving a rule-based order. For a while, the United States looked like the ultimate guarantor of such an order. That is less clear now, especially for Europe, as the US seems more focused on Asia. And the Europeans are expected to play a greater role. And my question is very simple. What are your expectations in that regard? What do you expect from the Europeans today in that unsettled situation?
D'abord, je voudrais vous saluer tous et vous dire que je suis très heureuse de pouvoir participer à ce panel et saluer le président Borrell. Et je crois que le sujet est extrêmement actuel parce que la question peut-être de savoir ce que l'on attend des États-Unis. En réalité, pour nous, pour la Géorgie, nous avons été le pays qui a réellement marqué la sortie, la fin de l'ère dans laquelle un certain nombre de règles s'imposaient à tout le monde. Avec la guerre en Géorgie en 2008, nous sommes sortis des règles internationales et le droit du plus fort, le droit de changer les frontières, le droit d'imposer son occupation sur un territoire qui était reconnu internationalement. Tout ça remet en cause toutes les normes dans lesquelles nous avons vécu. Et dès 2008, en réalité, nous voyons que les États-Unis ont agi plus verbalement. L'action, si on peut dire, est venue de l'Europe. l'action est venue du président Sarkozy, qui a de facto, par son intervention, permis d'arrêter le conflit. Non pas ensuite de renverser les résultats du conflit, pas de renverser l'occupation, mais en tout cas de l'arrêter sur le terrain. Donc c'est une date 2008 qui est extrêmement importante parce qu'elle voit ensuite sa continuation en Syrie, en 2014 en Ukraine, et c'est le début de une communauté internationale qui ne réagit plus aux violations du droit international. Après, on verra que les règles du désarmement elles-mêmes ne sont plus respectées. Et nous sommes dans un monde où les règles du jeu, on ne sait plus vraiment quelles elles sont. Et en même temps, et ça répond à votre question, en même temps, les États-Unis sont effectivement en train de se tourner vers l'Asie, vers l'Est, et implicitement, sans le dire tout à fait, disent à l'Europe, à vous de jouer dans cette partie du monde qui est votre continent. À vous d'y régler les conflits. Si on se reporte un peu en arrière, Jean-Marie se souvient comme moi de la crise des Balkans. Dans la crise des Balkans, les Européens, en réalité, ont laissé les Américains et l'OTAN non seulement régler la partie militaire du conflit, mais la partie diplomatique a elle aussi été essentiellement jouée par les Américains, par l'ambassadeur Holbrooke. Aujourd'hui, c'est de moins en moins le cas. Je ne dirais pas que ce n'est plus le cas, mais c'est de moins en moins le cas. Et donc, pour moi, pour la Géorgie, nous sommes aujourd'hui les yeux tournés davantage, je dirais, vers l'Europe, toujours vers l'OTAN qui représente cette alliance entre l'Europe et les États-Unis, mais sans doute conscient, surtout après l'Afghanistan où nous étions présents avec les Américains et comme proportionnellement l'une des contributions les plus importantes à la population de notre pays. Après le retrait d'Afghanistan, nous savons que cela a des conséquences également pour notre région et que notre région rentre en réalité dans la zone qui revient à l'Union européenne. Alors on reviendra après à ce que ça signifie pour l'Union européenne qui est confrontée à tous les défis, je dirais aujourd'hui. Mais je voudrais d'abord vous céder la parole et on reviendra sur ce que cela signifie pour l'Union européenne et partant pour nous.
Thank you very much. And I want to follow up with a question. You have this big neighbor, Russia. And the whole question of the relations with Russia is a question that haunts Europe because we want at the same time to defend our values and at the same time to build the cooperative world. And so I think all of us are interested in your views on what is your vision of relations with Russia, with this big neighbor you have, and which big neighbor that all Europeans have?
Eh bien, pour l'Europe comme pour nous-mêmes, nous sommes aujourd'hui devant une Russie donc qui ne respecte plus les anciennes règles du jeu, celles auxquelles elles avaient participé dans la période de Helsinki à l'élaboration de ces règles, encore une fois, que ce soit les règles de principe de droit international, le désarmement, et on est face à une Russie qui s'affirme avec toutes les armes à sa disposition. Alors on voit les forces Wagner dans l'Afrique, jusque loin en Afrique centrale. On voit l'utilisation tout récemment en Biélorussie, à travers la Biélorussie, de l'arme des migrants. Ce n'est plus une simple crise migratoire, mais c'est l'utilisation des migrants comme une véritable arme de déstabilisation des pays européens. L'ordre international qui n'existe plus entre l'Europe proprement dite et la Russie, c'est tout un terrain qui est un terrain ouvert à la déstabilisation, y compris nous-mêmes. Et l'Europe est au défi de cette nouvelle Russie. La principale question que nous nous posons, c'est de voir que est-ce que l'Europe se contente en quelque sorte d'un succès d'année de politique, qui est la politique des sanctions, qui est une réponse certainement insuffisante. C'est une réponse, mais ce n'est pas suffisant, et on le voit, pour influer, pour changer, pour faire réfléchir ou reculer la Russie. Donc ça veut dire que cette politique doit être plus globale. Et je dois dire un petit peu comme en 2008, la Géorgie a été le terrain d'essai de la Russie, qui depuis a commencé à se réarmer directement. Aujourd'hui, le Caucase est un petit peu le terrain test de ce que l'Union européenne peut faire dans sa politique vis-à-vis de cette région voisine et vis-à-vis de la Russie. On a vu cette année un engagement tout nouveau qui est un engagement de l'Union européenne dans la stabilité politique. En Géorgie, le président Charles Michel est venu 3 fois en l'espace de 6 mois et s'est mêlé directement de la stabilisation, de la sortie de crise du pays. Il est également trop tard parce que la guerre avait déjà eu lieu et le cessez-le-feu, mais il y a eu une marque de la volonté de l'Union européenne de reprendre la main et la médiation sur l'Arménie et l'Azerbaïdjan, ce qui est indispensable parce que c'est vraiment le pourtour de l'Europe et c'est un conflit qui ne peut pas être laissé à la seule Russie, à la seule Turquie, voire à d'autres puissances. Alors que faire au Caucase? La confrontation directe avec la Russie, ce n'est pas la voie et ce n'est pas une voie européenne et ce n'est pas une voie pour laquelle l'Europe a aujourd'hui ni la puissance militaire ni la volonté, mais c'est qu'elle doit montrer qu'elle est un acteur présent et qu'elle ne laisse pas la place. Il y a beaucoup de discussions aujourd'hui sur quel format de grands projets d'infrastructure à travers cette région qui est la place tournante et communicante entre l'Europe, la mer Noire, la mer Caspienne et l'Asie. Ce ne peut pas être une région qui devient l'exclusivité aujourd'hui de qui que ce soit, ni de la Russie, ni de la Turquie, ni de l'Iran. Et on voit très bien que ces puissances-là qui sont présentes et qui ont chacune des mérites d'être présentes, d'avoir des intérêts en tout cas dans la région, aucune de ces puissances n'a les moyens économiques en réalité de mener à bien les grands projets d'infrastructure dont tout le monde parle. La seule qui a cette puissance, c'est l'Europe. Donc il faut qu'elle ait, outre cette puissance économique, une vision de ce qu'elle veut faire, une vision de stabilisation de la région et une conscience de ce qui fait sa force aujourd'hui. Et sa force ne peut venir que de reprendre un grand projet politique. Alors elle a eu un grand projet qui a fonctionné d'une façon extraordinaire, c'était le projet de l'élargissement. Aujourd'hui, ce projet, on ne sait pas s'il est arrêté ou s'il est sous question. En tout cas, il ne traduit plus la même volonté politique et il demande à être ou revisité ou en tout cas soutenu par d'autres projets immédiats, jusqu'au moment où la question de l'élargissement redeviendra une vision d'ensemble de l'Union européenne. Pour être présente là, comme pour être présente en Ukraine, c'est un peu le même débat, ou sur les pourtours de la Méditerranée, l'Europe aussi doit reprendre confiance en elle, ce qui est très difficile au moment où elle est justement contestée par tous ces défis que l'on voit, que ça soit, tous les défis sont sur son terrain, le terrorisme, les attaques cyber, la drogue et les migrants, les migrants comme armes et les migrants comme réelle crise qui vient affaiblir les sociétés européennes. Et face à ça, on a besoin et on attend une Europe qui sache redécouvrir ses valeurs. Il y a aussi là un problème entre les États-Unis et l'Europe. Le consensus de Washington, on ne sait plus s'il existe véritablement, mais l'Europe, fière de ses valeurs, doit redevenir porteuse de ses valeurs. Le libéralisme américain, d'une certaine façon, a provoqué les crises intérieures en Europe, crise identitaire, les nations européennes qui n'ont pas la même vision de ce qu'est l'histoire et l'identité européenne, et la Russie joue sur ces divisions et se présente tout à fait de façon usurpée comme le défenseur des valeurs classiques européennes. Et c'est là où l'Europe doit se remettre au centre avec ses valeurs de liberté, de solidarité, d'individualisme et d'humanisme qui ne sont pas exactement la même chose que le socialement correct d'aujourd'hui des États-Unis, qui à bien des écarts peut apparaître comme étranger aux différentes cultures européennes. Donc il y a un très grand travail attendu de l'Europe et attendu de l'Europe par ses voisins pour lesquels la stabilité passe par cette confiance en soi de l'Europe.
Well, thank you very much. And I think we have the right man to answer all those questions. So I'll turn to Joseph Borrell. Europe is an herbivore in a world of carnivore. So my question is simple. How should Europe deal with the carnivores? Is it going to further weaponize connectivity like the carnivores do? How is it going to be at the same time strong, defending its values, as we were reminded by the president of Georgia, and safeguarding the possibility of cooperation, which has been at the heart of the European project?
Well, look, first of all, allow me to congratulate to both of you, to Mark and Jean-Marie for your books. I just finished yours, Jean-Marie. I found it very, very interesting. This idea that nous avons perdu le triomphalisme des démocraties après la chute du mur de Berlin et le triomphe de l'individu. J'ai trouvé ça très intéressant. Et je commence maintenant. I am starting the age of peace, Mark, and I'm sure it will be also very, very, very interesting to read to both of you. Look, carnivores and herbivores. What is true is the number of carnivores has been increasing quite a lot. So the landscape has become much more dangerous. There are many people around that like to eat the others. The strongmen and the authoritarian regimes, nationalism plus populism makes things much more dangerous. And I think that we Europeans, we should become a little bit omnivores, not only herbivores. In another way, we would like to live in a canned world, but our world is not a canned world, it's a hub's world, and we cannot pretend to be just a soft power, a kind of a macrocephalic Switzerland, just trade plus human rights plus the rule of law. That's good. That's not enough. The landscape has changed a lot, and we have to adapt our mental fits to this new strategic landscape. One can be an herbivore when there are a lot of herbivores around, like-minded countries, no? Canada, New Zealand, US. But today, this is not the case. So I think that the Europeans have to understand that they need to be something more than just a soft power. I am not calling to become a new empire or having the same military capacities than the US, because we will always privilege negotiation over confrontation. We will always privilege dialogue, we will privilege multilateralism. But if you want to support this approach, you have to have power. There are different ways of showing power. But at the end, there is also the power that comes from the capacity to use force. And this is what we are trying to do. to build capacities from the European side in order to assume our responsibility. Look, when it comes to climate change, for example, the three big authoritarian regimes, Mr. Xi, Putin, Erdogan, were not in Glasgow. They were not in Glasgow because there it was about solving problems through multilateral dialogue and scientific approach. And they are not interested in that. They are interested on power politics. I think that we have to work on a way of non-multilateralism because 200 countries, 197 countries are too many in order to reach agreements. We have to work on a kind of plurilateralism with group of countries solving problems, and the JCPOA is a good example of that, trying to solve the Iranian nuclear problem. The taxation, the international taxation, solved at the OCDE, with Europeans pushing for it. The methane pledge, also an European idea, putting together not the whole international community, but an important but reduced number of countries ready to engage in some specific issue. Taxation, methane, nuclear with Iranians. We have to make agreements at the regional level with other regions in the world, African Union, ASEAN, Arab League, Latin America. Let's be less ambitious and not to have everybody on board, but working in groups, in regions, in order to face concrete problems. But more important than that is the fact that we need to understand that soft power is not enough, because today everything is being weaponized. We see that on the border of Lithuania and Belarus, pushing people against the border. A simple migrant is becoming a bullet, it's being weaponized. Trade is also being weaponized. The elements that were soft power today has become hard power. And in order to survive in this new brave world, completely different from the world that Javier Solana was describing on his first strategy, the Europeans have to learn to use the language of power, not only the power of trading or the power of sanctioning with travel bans or frozen assets, but the power that brings you to retaliate when you are being threatened or attacked. And this is a difficult exercise because the European Union was built upon the idea of a refusal of power, was built over the fact that power has been too much used in the past, bringing to wars, and the refusal of power politics. And now we have to accept that the world, the way it is, requires from our side also to be part of a competition that requires capacities and the will to use them, because sometimes we have capacities. What it's lacking is the political will to use them or the unity in order to decide how, when, and where to use them. So an omnivore, you have to become an omnivore.
And I mean, very briefly, but this omnivore, I mean, in the quadrangle that is emerging of US, EU, China, Russia, what is the specificity of Europe in that quadrangle? The president of Georgia alluded to that. How do you see the omnivore relating to the other omnivore, the United States, and in particular also dealing with China?
Well, it's certain that the US-China confrontation will mark the 21st century. But this new polarity is different from the previous one, from the Cold War, between Western world and the Soviet Union. This old Cold War was a real war, military confrontation. There were not economic or financial or trade relationship between the US and the Soviet Union. There were two worlds apart, confronted, military and technology. There were not trade, no financing relationship. This is not the case with China today. With China is the biggest treasury of the US. The interest rate, the exchange rate of the dollar, we can say it's in the hand of the Chinese Communist Party, taking into account the big amount of dollars they have bought. And the trade relationship, I don't have to describe that, how important they are. And we are closer to the US, certainly. We are not equidistant. With the US, we share the same political system, multi-party competition, imperfect democracy, but democracy at the end, the right of the people to choose their government, an economic system, trade, a market, free. It makes us much closer to Washington. But it doesn't mean that we will be aligned with Washington all the time in anything, in allies, but not aligned. We have our own interests, and we have to preserve our interests that sometimes don't coincide with the US. We have differences with the US, and not exactly the same thing. The death penalty, the role of the religion, the side of the welfare state makes us quite different. But we are both the sons of the Enlightenment, and we have been building for 70 years a transatlantic relations. So closer to the US, but not aligned with the US. China is for us a competitor, a rival, and a partner. And we have to mix these three things in different combinations, depending on the issue and on the circumstances. And we also have to think about the deep tendencies of the American society. We have seen the Trump phenomena, and one can think about it and discuss if Trump was an exception, an accident of the history, or maybe, by the contrary, Biden may be the last transatlantic president. So there are phenomena, sociological phenomena, in the root, on the basis of our European and American society, we are quite divergent. China has been a big disappointment. When in 2001, China became member of the World Trade Organization, we were expecting, maybe a little bit naive, that le doux commerce, the trade, would make people change their mind. The middle class will be growing, and this middle class will be asking for freedom, and the political system will change. Well, it will never be like Switzerland or social democracy in the Nordic states, but something different from the very much centralized Communist Party and the very much assertive global power. And this has not been the case at all. China has not been following this pattern. By the contrary, he has following a completely different way, and this makes us to look at China from this triple point of view, which, by the way, is more or less the same that the US have. They use different words, but they are talking about the same thing. Rivalry, not a permanent rivalry, but rivals, because our systems are different, and are competing in Africa and in South America. They are competing to present them as the best ones. And China exerts a certain fascination to the people, because maybe its system could be better from the point of view of providing socioeconomic development. And is it as a partner and is a competitor. And we have to live with this complex relationship, closer to Washington, but not aligned on everything with Washington.
Thank you very much. Now we are going to turn to Mark Leonard to give us the solutions. We all agree, Mark, that although the offensive use of connectivity is as old as international trade, and I was reminded of Napoleon using the continental blockade, today with not only goods, it's people, it's money that are on the move, and so the opportunities for offensive use of connectivity are multiplying accordingly, as we see at the border of Belarus. I think we also agree that the distinction between war and peace is increasingly blurred. And I stress in my own book how the brittleness of our own societies is a perfect backdrop for that proliferation of skirmishes, what you call unpeace, that can destroy our societies. You write at the end of your book, I quote, that the biggest challenge to the liberal order comes from within our divided societies. And we have heard from Joseph Borrell and Salome Zurabishvili what needs to be done to fix relations between states and to safeguard a rule-based order. But if you are right, and I think you are, that work has to start at home, within our own society. So to use your nice formula of disarming connectivity, how do you do it within our own societies?
Thank you very much, Jean-Marie. And what I say follows on very well from what both what you said, but also what Josep Borrell and Salome Zurabishvili were saying earlier, which is that we are living through a period where many of our illusions are being challenged. I'm a kind of proud internationalist who grew up with the idea that by binding people together, we could end up minimizing conflict between countries, creating global harmony, and the European Union in many ways was the sort of ultimate expression of how one could turn enemies into friends by binding them together as tightly as possible. But what I think we've seen in recent times is that connectivity and interdependence creates conflict as much as it brings people together. And as you say, the thesis of my book is very much that it creates a motive for people to conflict with each other by encouraging polarization and a sense of envy and a loss of control within our societies. It gives people more opportunities to conflict with each other because war and peace in traditional terms have become unbelievably dangerous with nuclear weapons. But somehow weaponizing connectivity is a much cheaper way of exercising power, which is why we're seeing this proliferation of sanctions, of election interference, cyber crimes, and even the weaponization of migration. But it also, I think, creates a widespread sense of insecurity because a lot of the things that we saw as making our societies richer and stronger and giving us unprecedented opportunities are now also seen as creating a risk and creating vulnerabilities. And it's those tensions which have come out most strongly on globalization. We've seen them in the economic realm where many of our societies are polarized between the people who think of themselves as winners, who are more cosmopolitan and attached to the world and see globalization as bringing them opportunities, giving them freedoms which they never had before. And the people who feel that they've been left behind, who see exactly the same forces creating a sense of vulnerability, driving their wages down and making them stagnate, introducing migration, terrorism, other kinds of insecurity into their societies. But also the language that we hear in many countries is people also being scared of cultural change, of becoming strangers in their own lands. And that has created an appetite for populist political movements who want to build walls and try and shut themselves off from other places. And Trump and Brexit were the two most violent manifestations of that in 2016, but we see those forces everywhere. And I think that, the big lesson of recent times, particularly within the European Union, is that what we need to do is be thinking less about how do we liberalize things, how do we rip down the barriers, and more, how can the EU itself restore a sense of control to people over their everyday lives? And that, has lots of different elements. It includes thinking about our economic policy in different terms so that we look at who the losers are as well as the winners and try and help them out. It's about our trade policies where we're sort of less focused on liberalizing at all costs and thinking more about what kind of industrial strategies do we need to make sure that we can have innovation, that we can have jobs for the future, being more wary about investment from other countries like China that have different outlooks and different electoral systems, but also speaking a different language to people. I think one of the reasons why people were so angry with European integration and with globalization is that we looked at the aggregate figures, which showed that these things were fantastic for society in the whole. And we told people that they were all winners, but many people felt that they were losers. And I think one of the interesting things which you see from elections, such as the German election, where Olaf Scholz was talking about respect, there's a different kind of language, which means that we don't just focus our resources on the kind of winners and on the big companies that inhabit our gleaming metropolises, but we think about how we can make life better for other people, but also how we can show them that they are respected members of society rather than the sort of deplorables that Hillary Clinton was talking about.
Well, thank you very much. I see that the clock is ticking, and I want to give some space for the audience. But actually, there's a question, Mark, from the audience. There's several questions from the audience that, in a way, you are in a good position to answer. Many in the audience question whether we have done globalization right. And so that's very much linked to your vision of connectivity. And maybe you can say a word of that, because before I ask questions to Josep Borrell and Salome Zurabishvili. So briefly, because I see we have roughly 10 minutes left and I want to do justice to the audience.
I think we've done globalization very badly wrong, because what we've done is we've created a sort of winner-takes-all version of globalization, where our main goal was about ripping down walls and barriers rather than actually maintaining consent for our connected world. And if we were starting again, I think we should have started with a much better sense of who the losers were as well as the winners, and to try and prepare them for the new world that we're living in, and to show them that the state and politics was on their sides rather than making their lives more difficult. And I think that's the big lesson that you see in a lot of the political changes that are going on at the moment. When Joe Biden talks about a foreign policy for the middle classes, that's the sort of essence behind that. When we talk about European sovereignty or strategic autonomy or une Europe qui protège, it's very much this idea that Europe should be acting as the first line of defense against a dangerous world, rather than globalization writ small, that's kind of acting as a further disruptor of people's social fabric. And in China as well, there are these big debates about dual circulation, which is also showing a new sensibility about how China wants to engage with the world. What we realize is that interdependence is great. It is the engine of human progress, but it has a dark side as well. And if we're aware of what that dark side is, of the vulnerabilities that we have, and try and organize ourselves in a way that we both protect the most vulnerable in our societies, but we also don't end up accidentally putting ourselves in relationships of dependence where we can be bullied and blackmailed by other players, then we can actually take advantage of something which has not just made us much richer, but also has made our cultural lives much richer, has given us ideas and progress which was unthinkable for earlier generations, but which also has led to this pervasive sense of instability, which I think is currently poisoning our politics as well.
Thank you very much. Now I have a couple of questions for the High Representative. One member of the audience asked whether the EU and its member states are ready to use hybrid methods toward hostile states and entities which use such methods. And a question also on force. How can the force be established? Is it a European army? How should Europeans go about creating sort of hard power?
Look, European army is a way of talking, but it's not in the agenda. We are not going to create an European army cancelling the national armies. The army, together with the border and the territory and the currency, are the very signals of sovereignty. So we are not going to create a European army that will make a parade in the Brussels streets once a year, like the French army parades in the 14th of July. But what do we need to do is to pool the capacities of the member states, creating a European capability to be deployed when the interest of Europe and the security of Europe is being affected. Not an European army, but European military capabilities, pulling together the capabilities of the member states, training them together, making them interoperable, and to be able to deploy a certain number of these capacities. And this is very modest and at the same time quite difficult, because we have been trying to do that for years without succeeding on that. We created the battlefields, the battle groups, and we never use it. And the Europeans go to the operational field, not under the European banner, not under the rules of European institutions, but as coalitions of the will of some member states, with one in the lead, another following. What we need to do is to have Europeans, it means under the European Union institutions, capacities, able to be deployed to face crisis in our neighborhood. Not an European army, but military capabilities, modular capabilities that we could put together as a puzzle, provided by the member states, trained together in order to act together when needed. About if we will use hybrid tools or hybrid instruments against others. We don't want to use any kind of instrument against others, but in the new landscape, the war will not be, as Mark and Jean-Marie says, something clearly different from peace. It will be intermediate stages in which we will have to face challenges and threats which are not the classical military ways of fighting, but that can create a lot of problems. A cyber attack, it's much more effective than bombing with classical bombs. And a hybrid attack, we can say that today in the Belarusian border there is a hybrid, I don't know if to use the word attack, but a hybrid threat. It has to be faced with the same kind of warfare. You cannot face a cyber attack with a classical military warfare. You have to have cyber defense against cyber attack. And you have to be able to face a hybrid threat or a hybrid attack with hybrid tools. We are not going to repel the neighbors of the Belarusian border with machine guns. We cannot contrapose the classical warfare to the new forms of warfare. And yes, we have to develop this hybrid cyber capacity also.
Thank you. There is a question specifically directed to the President of Georgia, which is about how can Georgia's dilemma, necessary balancing various imperatives considering its geopolitical situation, how best to address it? With America, with Europe, with the Russian diplomatic exercise? How in this configuration should Georgia play its cards to ensure its sovereignty and safety and security?
Je crois qu'il est clair depuis justement la guerre de 2008 que personne ne viendra faire la guerre pour défendre la Géorgie et que la Géorgie a réussi, en dépit de cette différence du faible au fort qui a existé pendant la guerre et qui existe depuis, sa principale victoire a été de conserver malgré tout son orientation européenne. Et si le but de la Russie, en occupant ces territoires, en entrant militairement sur le territoire de la Géorgie, c'était de la finlandiser, de l'empêcher de faire ses choix stratégiques, ce résultat n'a pas été obtenu. Et comme je l'ai dit, la perspective, et la seule perspective, c'est la proximité avec l'Europe, mais c'est une Europe plus engagée et une Europe qui ait conscience qu'en réalité, si aujourd'hui la Russie utilise tous les moyens, mais elle utilise des moyens de force négative, dans le monde de demain, l'Union européenne, l'Europe a d'autres capacités, d'autres atouts de puissance qui sont l'innovation technologique, qui sont la vitalité économique, qui sont les ressources humaines qui vont avec la capacité d'initiative, de liberté, d'entreprise, et que tout ça, ça fait que dans le monde futur, il viendra un moment de rééquilibrage parce que la seule force pure n'est pas non plus suffisante, mais à ce moment-là, il faut savoir négocier. Jusqu'à présent, l'Europe a choisi de dialoguer, et c'est souvent un dialogue du faible au fort, et sans très bien savoir ce qu'elle veut obtenir de ce dialogue. Il faut passer du dialogue à une vraie négociation, en sachant où sont les lignes rouges, où sont les intérêts, où sont les forces, où sont les faiblesses. Et dans cette négociation dure, mais équilibrée et juste, nous sommes avec l'Europe. Jamais sans l'Europe.
Well, thank you very much. I think we are coming, sadly, to the end of this fascinating conversation. I want to thank our three panelists. I want to thank the audience. I apologize to those who didn't get their question answered. I think to address cooperation in an antagonistic world, we need more than 45 minutes, to be honest. But we have learned a lot in these 45 minutes. We certainly learned that the more connected we are, the more potentially powerful we are, but also the more vulnerable we are. We did not address the question of the we. Who are we? And we talk about China, United States, Russia, Europe as self-evident entities. But are they and are we? That's a very pertinent question, especially for Europe. So in the competitions among powers, I would conclude by saying that we have to know who we are, and that was alluded to by, I think, all of you. And we have to see whether there is some common ground that can be found based on shared interest, and ideally on some shared values. And that's a tough slug in the present world. But I think with leaders like Joseph Borrell, Salome Zerabishvili, Mark Leonard, we're in good shape to continue the fight for a world that is based on principles rather than just the raw use of power. Thank you.